So right here, you can see we have 6 different algorithms that attempt to preserve pitch while adjusting tempo, or preserve tempo while adjusting pitch. The default warp mode that you're going to encounter is going to be beats mode. And especially for vocals and acapellas and kind of melodic content, it's usually not going to sound the smoothest. And this is something that could turn off someone who's trying to do some smooth tempo adjustments without it sounding good. So check out if I do that same experiment where I play it back at 80 beats per minute, but this time I switched it to the beats
Feels
mode.
so close to you right now. It's a force.
It sounds like Calvin Harris is stuttering, which is not good, right? We don't want him to be stuttering while he's delivering these awesome vocals. So so typically if we have an audio file and we want to slow it down like we did, what happens is essentially the waveform gets stretched out or longer. The longer the waveform, it results in a slower tempo, but it also results in a lower pitch. So when we're warping, we have the option of how beats mode works, or how all these warp modes is it doesn't just stretch it out like that. If we wanted it to just get stretched out, we're going to choose the warp mode called re-pitch. Let's take a listen to how it sounds now. You notice we lost the ability to transpose over here, but let's hear what it sounds like now when we slow it down.
Feels so close to you right now. It's a force field.
One more.
I wear my heart up.
If I go even slower, it's going to get even lower.
Feels so close to you right.
And if we go, what's going to happen if we go faster? We're going to get the chipmunk effect, and it's going to get faster, but also higher in pitch.
Feels so close to you
Right now, it's a force field. I wear my heart up on my sleeve like a big deal.
We do some happy hardcore remix or something like that. So re-pitch is going to make it behave exactly as if the audio was being played back on a Technique 1200 turntable. If you have a record and if you speed it up or slow it down, it's going to change the tempo, but it's also going to increase or decrease the pitch. So that's re-pitch mode. It's out of all the warp modes that we have to choose from, it's the purest or smoothest or cleanest algorithm, because it's not actually redrawing or manipulating or chopping up the waveform. Now, however, most of the time we're not going to be in re-pitch mode. The default warp mode is beats mode. So how beats mode works is when we're slowing audio down, instead of stretching it out like re-pitch mode does, or just stretching it out like this, what happens is it chops up your audio into little pieces. So these little white or gray markers you see over the transients of your audio are called pseudo warp markers. They're there. Another word for them would be transient markers. They're there to make it easier for you to find where words or syllables or beats within the audio starts. So when beats mode is enabled and we're slowing down our audio, what happens is it just slices up your audio into little pieces. And then if it wants to play it slower, it puts gaps of silence in between those little pieces. So I'm going to slow my master tempo way down to like 40 beats per minute, 41.
Feels so close to you.
So now you can hear the gaps of silence after those little chops have been put in there, and it doesn't sound very natural. It sounds rather unnatural, not too smooth, and kind of weird and choppy sounding. By default, beats mode is going to sound like this.
Feels so.
Which is even kind of crazier and weirder sounding. So there, within beats mode, the bottom section here is we have a preserve function. What the preserve function does is after it slices our audio up into little pieces like these, like those that you can hear right there, what it will do is instead of leaving a gap of silence in between each of these slices, like we can see right here, what it does is it will play the end of the slice, and then it'll play to the end of the slice and then play it backwards and then play it again and forward. So it'll get to the end, play it backwards, then play it forward. move on to the next slice, play it backwards, play it forward. I'm going to slow it down a lot, all the way down to the minimum value, and it should be a little bit easier to actually hear what it's doing. So it repeats the playback of each slice in forwards and reverse as an attempt to smooth it out or fill in what would be gaps of silence.
Feels so close to you.
So that's pretty fun, right? It's so, in some ways it's a little bit more natural sounding than just leaving those gaps of silence, but in some ways it sounds really crazy at the same time.
Feels
So this is the default mode. It's forward and backwards. It's the back and forth transient preserve function. If we switch it to just this middle option, this will repeat or fill in those slices, but it's going to just play the slices going forwards.
Feels so close.
It sounds a little bit less natural, but still kind of crazy and fun at the same time. If this was an extreme, if this was an extreme workshop, and if this was an extreme tempo adjustment, like if we're slowing down to 30 beats per minute, it's going to be really obvious. But if we're just going from 128 to 120, the effect is going to be less obvious. So if we're slowing it down just a little bit, it becomes less obvious what beats mode is doing.
Feels so close to you right
to me,
now.
It's still doing those repeats of the individual slices, but it makes it sound a little bit warbly is the best adjective I can come up with.
Feels so close
you
to
slow it down even more, it becomes even more kind of
feels so close.
kind of weird and warbly. Sometimes the forward method will work a little bit better.
Feels so close to you.
It still doesn't sound smooth. So I very rarely will use beats mode on vocals unless I'm going for some really crazy abstract types of manipulations. Like, let's say if I come over here and on purpose, I want a section to be really stretched out. I can take this and move it way over here for this section. I'm just like doing an extreme stretch now. It's going to play normal. Let me go back up to 120 something. So now when I play it,
And
one more.
and there's no stopping us right now.
That was pretty fun. that came out better than I thought it would. Going back now to just the regular acapella where we're at here, it's important to know which warp mode we should choose from. So we talked about beats mode. The next mode is tones mode. Tones is kind of developed initially for monophonic content like a voice or something like a bass or a lead sound or something.
Feels so.
So how tones mode works is instead of chopping up your audio into little pieces based on the transient markers that we see here, what it does is it takes a small sample and it will repeat that small sample over time if it needs to play the sample for longer, or in turn slowing down the tempo. So I'm going to slow down the tempo a lot, and it's going to make it really kind of easy and obvious to hear what these individual grains sound like, or the individual samples that it's taking.
Feels so close.
You can kind of hear they sound a little bit
Feels
marbly
so
or pebbly. If I increase the grain size, the samples are going to get bigger, and it's going to sound like larger grains of audio.
Feels so close to you right now.
So it sounds, compared to beats mode, it almost always is gonna sound a lot smoother.
Feels so.
Here's beats mode, and I'll go back to tones.
Feels so close.
And it has its own kind of unique character to the way it preserves the pitch when you're reducing your audio. Texture mode works on the same fundamental principle as tones mode, except we have one extra parameter. We have a flux parameter at the bottom of our grain size adjustment. Does anyone remember what the flux capacitor was on the DeLorean from Back to the Future? What that did? Anyone at all? Anyways, what the flux parameter in our texture mode does is it induces an amount of randomness into the grain size. So when the flux is all the way down, it's going to sound pretty much exactly like tones mode if you have the grain size set to the same value.
Feels so close.
So if I go to tones and set the grain size to be 65,
Feels so
almost exactly the same. But now if I go back to texture mode and crank up the flux amount, it's going to randomly increase and decrease the grain size while it's playing to create some variations in there.
feels so close to you right now.
And just that amount of randomness makes it harder for the listener to kind of perceive the individual grains that are repeating, and in turn can make it sound more less synthesized and a little bit more natural. Also with texture mode, we can go way smaller or way larger with the grain size.
Feels so.
We can go all the way down to just a value of 2 for the grain size.
Feels so.
And it even sounds completely different then. Or we can go all the way up to 263.
Feels so.
And then at that point, it starts to sound like beats mode again. Moving on, we talked about repitch mode, which again, it's just gonna pitch it up.
So close.
It's not gonna chop it up or resample the audio in any way. And then finally, we get to the holy grail of warp modes, which is complex mode and complex pro. So complex mode, by definition, it uses a complex algorithm to preserve pitch and tempo when we're adjusting one or the other. I'm going to slow us back down to the same amount, and let's see if just take a listen to hear what it sounds like.
Feels so close to you.
Overall, in most cases, it's going to sound the smoothest out of all of the warp modes. So it works great on things like vocals or melodic instruments or things that are delicate. What it does is it takes up more processing power, but what it does is it automatically sets a microscopic grain size based on the frequency of the audio that it's analyzing. At least that's the best I can explain what it's doing. So you get these almost unnoticeable grain sizes that are really small and constantly morphing to best suit the audio that you're warping. So let's see if you guys can hear a difference between complex and complex pro now.
Feels so close.
Okay, here's complex pro, back to complex.
Feels so close.
I'm not sure if you guys could hear a difference between the two, but I didn't. That's because most of the time you're only going to notice a largely audible difference between the two warp modes when you're transposing the audio. So I'm gonna transpose this up 5 semitones, and let's hear what complex mode sounds like.
Feels so close to you.
And let's switch it to complex pro.
Feels so close.
There was a big difference there. Let's go back. Let's make it -5. I'm actually going to speed our tempo back up just because it's taking a long time to play it at 30 beats per minute.
Feels so close to you right now.
Here's complex pro, and here is complex.
Feel so close to you right now.
It sounded almost like 2 completely different vocals at that stage. And the further we transpose it, the bigger the difference you're going to hear between the 2 algorithms.
Feel so close.
Here's complex. Here's complex pro.
Feels so close to you right now.
Pretty crazy. So what the difference between complex pro versus normal complex mode is that complex pro has a formant preserve function, which you can adjust. What the formant of a voice, whether it's an instrument or a human voice, it's kind of the size of the human or the size of the instrument is the best way to think about it. Instruments or humans with larger formant or like a bass typically sound larger or bigger. If you have a smaller formant, you sound kind of smaller or more feminine or more microscopic sounding. So typically if we have like a string on a guitar, for example, if I play an E string on a guitar, and if you compare that to the string of a ukulele, which is really small and really tiny, you can tell which one is a ukulele. It's a higher pitch. It's a higher the string is shorter compared to the string on a full 6-string guitar because the string is longer. The body is bigger. The same thing works with voices. As we increase or decrease the length of our vocal cords, we in turn make the voice or the human who's outputting that voice sound bigger or smaller.
Feels so close.
So with Complex Pro on, as I increase the pitch, what it's essentially doing is it's shrinking the voice or shrinking the vocal cords within your throat. So
Feels so close.
Close to you right now. It's a fuzz.
when I get past an octave, we've totally turned Calvin Harris into a chipmunk, right? He keeps getting smaller, the pitch gets higher, but it sounds like it's a smaller, an elf or a chipmunk kind of singing it.
Feels so close.
If we go the opposite way, it turns into, we start to make him get larger and larger until eventually he turns into a giant.
Feels so close to you right now. It's a force field.
Now he sounds like a giant, right? So if we want to change the pitch without changing the perceived size of the person or of the instrument, here's where Complex Pro comes in. What the Format Preserve attempts to do is to preserve the size of the instrument or the person, but also adjusting the pitch. So if I change the note,
Feels so close to you right
it
now.
sounds like Calvin is just singing a higher
Feels-
note as opposed to Calvin shrinking and singing a higher note.
Feels so close to you.
Again, Complex Pro.
Feels so.
If we go negative, again, lower note without him getting larger in size.
Feels so close.
Feels so close.
So depending on what you're doing with your vocal, sometimes you're going to want the effect, the chipmunk effect, or you're going to want the deep monster effect. And in that case, Complex Pro, you're not going to want to use just regular complex mode is going to sound better. In other scenarios, if you want to go for a more natural sound, if you're just transposing a few semitones, Complex Pro might help you out a little bit better than that. So you might be asking yourself, so why not just use Complex Pro all the time? There's a lot of scenarios where Complex Pro does not sound better. For an example of that, I'm going to go in and drop in a full song. Let's come here. I'm just going to go to my DJ music and let's find, let's go drum and bass. So there's a lot of scenarios where you're not going to want to use complex mode. Let's see if we can hear an example of that. So I'm going to turn warping on. This is a drum and bass song. I'm going to set my one count to be here. I believe that's the beginning. I'm going to choose warp from here straight. And let's bring our tempo down a little bit so it's closer to the original tempo of the track. And let's just take a listen. So I'm going to take this and speed it up a lot more. Right now, the warp mode is in beats mode, but I'm going to switch this to complex mode and see if you can hear a difference. Or see if you guys can notice a difference in how it's. And anyone notice a difference with that example?
It seems smoother. It seems smoother and complex.
So what happens, unfortunately, sometimes with complex mode is that especially if we have a lot of bass and punch within the beats, what happens is exactly what Kylie said. Complex mode will smooth out the transients and the bass, and you will lose a lot of punch into what you're hearing. So if you're warping a whole song and you're speeding it up and the bass is more important, the drums and bass are more important than the vocals and the clarity of each individual instrument, beats mode is going to sound better. So just be cautious of that. There's some other handy things you can do with beats mode. I'm going to pull up a hi-hat loop. Let's see. There's some fun things you can do with the transient preserve function. So check this out. So here's a hi-hat loop, and right now it's on beats mode. I'm gonna move our tempo back up to its normal. Let's say we like this hi-hat loop that I just pulled up, but I just want to tighten it up a little bit. I want it to sound more of like a closed hat loop and that resonance. So what you can do is turn off the transient loop mode, and then we can adjust the transient envelope. What this will do is actually tighten up the loop to make it sound more like a closed hi-hat instead of an open. So I totally took this, so it was an open hi-hat loop, and I tightened up the transients to make it sound closed. So with this one, I can take this one loop throughout the course of my whole song, and I can go from closed hi-hat to open hi-hat just by adjusting the transient preserve function. So that can work with any kind of audio, whether it's a kick drum. Let's try it with a kick for a second. So this one could work. Let's see what happens if I turn off the loop. It's really tight, and then boom, boom, I opened the bass back up just by adjusting that. You can go in and use it to reshape your drums in interesting ways.